Hi everyone, I am Nishita Gupta from Semester 2 Economics Honors, and I'm going to explain the topic, the applications of the costs of taxation. Without further ado, let us begin by understanding what is the deadweight loss of taxation. As we understood in chapter 6, that it does not matter whether the tax is levied on the buyers or the sellers. When the tax is levied on the buyers, the demand curve shifts downward by the size of the tax. And when it is levied on the sellers, the supply curve shifts upward by the size of that tax. In either case, when the tax is enacted by the government, the price paid by buyers rises and the price received by the sellers falls. To understand this better, let us take a look at this diagram. As we can see, after the tax was imposed, the price paid by buyers rises and the price received by sellers falls, along with a fall in quantity. This area is known as the size of the tax. Let us now understand how tax affects market participants. We will talk about how tax affects buyers, sellers, and the government during the course of this topic. The benefit received by buyers in the market is measured by consumer surplus. It is known as the amount buyers are willing to pay for a good minus the amount they actually pay for it. Similarly, the benefit received by sellers in a market is measured by the producer surplus. It is that amount that the sellers receive for a good minus their costs. But what about the government? Now, if T is the size of the tax and Q is the quantity sold, then the government generates a tax revenue of T multiplied by Q. We can understand this better using this diagram. The tax revenue of the government can be shown graphically as the rectangle between the supply and the demand curve. We can calculate the tax revenue by multiplying T with Q or by finding the area of this rectangle. The height of this rectangle is the size of the tax T and the width of this rectangle is the quantity sold Q. As we know, the area of rectangle is is width multiplied by height. Hence, we can calculate tax revenue by multiplying T with Q. Now, let us understand how tax affects welfare. Let us let us take a look at this diagram. As we all know that P1 is the price without tax and Q1 is the quantity. After the tax was imposed, price paid by buyers rises to PB and price received by sellers falls to PS. Now, we know that consumer surplus is the area which is above the price line but below the demand curve. Hence, initially, the consumer surplus was area A plus B plus C. However, after tax was imposed, it falls to only area A. Similarly, the producer surplus is the area below the price line and above the supply curve. Initially, before the enactment of tax, it was D plus E plus F. However, after tax was imposed, the producer surplus falls to only area F. Area B plus D is known as the tax revenue which is generated by the government. Now you must have noticed that the area C plus E was gained by none. Hence, we say that this area C plus E is the fall in the total surplus and is the deadweight loss of the tax. The deadweight loss is that for loss in consumer surplus which is resulted by tax or some other policy instrument which distorts the market outcome. Now, let us talk about the next topic, that is the determinants of deadweight loss. There are two major determinants of deadweight loss. Number one, tax distortions and elasticities, and number two, the size of the tax. Let us talk about how tax distortions and elasticities affect deadweight loss. Let us take a look at these diagrams. In panel A, we see that the supply is relatively inelastic. Hence, the deadweight loss is small. We also take into note that the size of the tax is same in all cases. In panel B, when supply is relatively elastic, the deadweight loss of tax is large, keeping the size of the tax same. Now you must notice how when the supply is relatively elastic, the deadweight loss is large. Talking about elasticity of demand, when demand is relatively inelastic and the size of the tax is same, the deadweight loss is comparatively smaller as compared to when the demand is relatively elastic and the size of the tax is same, the deadweight loss is large. Hence, we can infer more elastic the supply or demand, the more will be the deadweight loss. Let us move on to the next topic, which is how the size of the tax affects deadweight loss. Let us take a look at these diagrams. In panel A, we see when there is a small tax imposed, there is a small deadweight loss. In panel B, when there is a somewhat larger tax or a medium tax imposed, there is a medium deadweight loss of tax. However, in panel 3, when we impose a higher tax, the deadweight loss also increases. Now you must be wondering why this happens. We can infer this or we can understand this by the help of the Laffer's curve. As we know that tax revenue is the quantity multiplied by the amount of tax imposed by the government, and deadweight loss is that fall in total surplus which is resulted by the application of tax or some other policy instrument. When we impose a small tax, the tax revenue is also small. When we impose a medium tax, the tax revenue is also medium. However, this is important to note that when we impose a large tax, the tax revenue is very small. That is because the size of the market is shrinking too much. That is, the quantity sold or the quantity demanded falls way too much. As we can see in these diagrams, that as we increase the tax size, the size of the deadweight loss gradually keeps increasing. However, when tax size keeps on increasing, the tax revenue gradually increases, reaches its maximum point, and then starts to gradually fall. This is called the Laffer curve and the supply side economics. Thank you everyone for tuning in. This was applications of costs of taxation.